Many people harbor a common misconception about the fundamental pillars of capitalism. They envision a system founded on unfettered free markets, minimal governmental interference, and the optimistic belief that individual self-interest will miraculously align to create a harmonious and prosperous society. When pressed for the intellectual origins of this perspective, one invariably hears the name Adam Smith, the iconic figure often depicted in a powdered wig, revered as the father of modern economics and hailed as the preeminent prophet of laissez-faire principles. Yet, a significant challenge arises. The contemporary rendition of capitalism, which so readily invokes Smith's name, fundamentally misrepresents his actual convictions. Indeed, the very individuals who champion his legacy today frequently embody the precise dangers and behaviors against which he vociferously cautioned. Welcome to The Financial Historian, an exploration of where money, power, and history intricately collide, revealing that truth is seldom as straightforward as surface appearances suggest. Before delving into the pervasive concept of the invisible hand, it's crucial to take a foundational step back, as the true tenets of Smith's philosophy remain largely unknown to the general public. This isn't due to a lack of intellectual curiosity on their part. Rather, over the last 100 years, a comprehensive economic mythology has been meticulously constructed around Smith's persona, a narrative so deeply ingrained that it now registers as undisputed common sense. The core tenet of this narrative is straightforward. Government ought to disengage from economic affairs, markets should operate without any constraints, and unbridled competition will inherently generate widespread prosperity for all. This ideology was subsequently termed laissez-faire by economists, a French expression literally translating to let it be, but more precisely conveying the imperative of hands-off the economy. This popular account posits that Adam Smith was the originator of laissez-faire economics. It claims he staunchly advocated for markets to function entirely autonomously, free from any external meddling. It suggests his faith in individual avarice surpassed his trust in governmental institutions, and that he viewed completely unregulated commerce as the most pristine pathway to human advancement. It's an undeniably appealing narrative, conveniently simple, impeccably clean, and ideologically potent. However, this compelling tale suffers from a singular critical flaw. Adam Smith never uttered or wrote any such pronouncements, not a single one. Indeed, were Smith to witness the contemporary incarnation of what is proudly labeled free markets, he would likely question who dared to extensively revise his seminal works and, more importantly, why every vital caution and caveat had been systematically expunged. To truly grasp Smith's original thinking, we must return to the genuine world he inhabited, moving beyond the simplistic narratives and convenient slogans often attributed to him. Born in Scotland in 1723, Smith grew up in a land characterized by severe winters, constrained opportunities, and a rigid social structure where one's birthright held significantly greater sway than individual talent or merit. Far from being an exemplar of free markets, 18th-century Britain was, in fact, a formidable mercantilist empire. Commerce was meticulously orchestrated through royal monopolies, prices were fixed by powerful guilds, and entire industries fell under the dominion of tightly knit cartels. Moreover, global trade was largely dictated by gargantuan corporations such as the East India Company, an entity so powerful it maintained its own private army and functioned more akin to an independent sovereign state than a mere commercial enterprise. This was precisely the environment Smith meticulously analyzed, a world where economic might and political authority were profoundly intertwined, where markets were far from self-regulating. Instead, they were actively molded, swayed, and frequently manipulated by entrenched private interests. Indeed, a significant portion of Smith's life work involved a persistent admonition that merchants, when accumulating excessive influence, would inevitably exploit it to distort market rules and legal frameworks to their exclusive advantage. He famously observed that people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or in some contrivance to raise prices. In essence, Smith's insight was that whenever business interests converge, the broader public ultimately bears the cost. Such a sentiment stands in stark contrast to, and is hardly the guiding principle of, a system advocating for completely unregulated capitalism. Furthermore, a crucial detail often overlooked by conventional textbooks is that Adam Smith was not formally trained as an economist. In fact, he never even identified himself as such. His true vocation was that of a moral philosopher, a scholar deeply engrossed in the study of human behavior, the nuances of empathy and sympathy, and the intricate psychological underpinnings of fair, or conversely unfair, interpersonal conduct. Years before he penned his magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations, Smith authored The Theory of Moral Sentiments, a profound and densely philosophical treatise exploring the foundations of human morality. A careful reading of this foundational work immediately reveals Smith's conviction that societies can only truly flourish when individuals act with an inherent sense of decency and reciprocal responsibility. He did not subscribe to the notion that greed is the primary engine of human progress. Rather, he firmly believed that morality serves as humanity's guiding force. This brings us to arguably the most significant distortion within Smith's enduring legacy, the concept of the invisible hand. It's a catchphrase universally recognized, even by those unaware of its specific origins or context. The prevailing interpretation suggests that an unhindered market inherently steers society toward optimal outcomes. Yet, here lies the critical detail that proponents of modern capitalism conveniently suppress. Smith invoked this specific phrase a mere 3 times throughout his voluminous published works. 3 to be precise. Crucially, not a single instance posits it as an overarching, universal law governing markets. Nor does any usage imply a mandate to allow corporations unfettered freedom, for everything will spontaneously self-correct. And certainly, none proclaim that deregulation is the direct pathway to societal prosperity. If the invisible hand was not, in fact, the central tenet of Smith's economic philosophy, then what truly constituted its core? His profound conviction was that economies could only function effectively and fairly when power was widely dispersed, and diligently enforced rules maintained order and prevented abuse. Smith explicitly advocated for governmental intervention in critical sectors such as education, banking, essential public works, the management of natural monopolies, infrastructure development, and, significantly, in preventing the undue capture of the state by powerful corporate interests. He was a proponent of regulation, but of intelligent, well-considered regulation, not arbitrary or poorly designed constraints. Moreover, he dedicated numerous pages to vehemently cautioning against the dangers of corporations growing excessively powerful, overtly political, and deeply entrenched within the societal fabric. Smith's era was profoundly shaped by the East India Company, a corporate entity whose monopolistic reach was so immense it effectively governed vast territories, commanded its own armies, and dictated global trade routes. Smith himself characterized it as a blood-stained monopoly, identifying it as a profoundly destructive force that systematically warped market dynamics and severely corrupted governmental integrity. Were Adam Smith alive in our present age, observing the unchecked power of certain modern tech behemoths, sprawling pharmaceutical conglomerates, and dominant financial institutions, he would, in all likelihood, pose a singular poignant question. Did absolutely no one bother to actually read my work? The peculiar, and indeed darkly humorous, aspect of this historical reinterpretation is that Adam Smith has inadvertently been repurposed as the intellectual figurehead for an ideology he so explicitly cautioned against. This phenomenon is akin to a corporation brazenly appropriating the identity of its most trenchant critic to legitimize its very practices. To truly grasp the essence of Adam Smith's original message, one must confront a peculiar and striking fact. The famous invisible hand makes only a fleeting, almost negligible appearance across his entire body of work. Specifically, it is mentioned just 3 times, twice within his published books and once in an early, less prominent essay. Crucially, not one of these instances suggests that free markets inherently possess the capacity for self-correction or depicts the market as an autonomous, self-regulating mechanism. Nor can any of them be plausibly extended to endorse the contemporary notion that individual greed miraculously transmutes into societal harmony. In fact, these 3 references collectively underscore the inverse. Smith regarded the invisible hand as an infrequent exception rather than a governing rule, a unique and serendipitous occurrence where human actions inadvertently yield a beneficial outcome. It was not conceived as a fundamental law of economics, but rather as a mere footnote reflecting upon the inherent imperfections of human conduct. The initial mention of the invisible hand is found in the History of Astronomy, an intriguing early essay penned by Smith prior to his widespread renown. Within this text, the invisible hand serves as a metaphor for ancient superstitions, specifically, humanity's innate inclination to ascribe inexplicable phenomena to the intervention of deities. It bears absolutely no relation to markets, economics, or financial matters whatsoever. This is Smith, the discerning philosopher, observing how people construct reassuring narratives to impose order upon a chaotic world. One could argue that, ironically, if modern capitalism sought a truly accurate metaphor for its current operations, this original usage might prove far more apparent. However, for entirely self-evident reasons, this particular reference is never cited. The second, and indeed the most widely recognized, appearance of the invisible hand occurs in The Wealth of Nations. Yet even here, its critical context is routinely and conveniently disregarded. Smith illustrates the case of a merchant who opts to invest his capital domestically, driven by his apprehension regarding the inherent risks of international commerce. His motivation isn't patriotism, profound rationality, or enlightened economic foresight, but simply his personal fear. It is this fear, Smith explains, that propels him toward a decision which, entirely unintentionally, yields a beneficial outcome for domestic industry. And that is the extent of it. It's not presented as a governing law of economics, nor as a universal principle applicable in all scenarios. It is merely a singular instance where a private apprehension inadvertently generates a public good. However, when subsequent economists sought a compelling slogan to rationalize widespread deregulation, they elevated this isolated anecdote into the status of an immutable, almost divine law. Were irony to possess a patron saint, that figure would undoubtedly bear a striking resemblance to Adam Smith, silently observing the profound misinterpretations of his own writings. The third and conclusive instance of the invisible hand can be found in the theory of moral sentiments, and this particular usage proves even more profoundly illuminating. Smith here laments that affluent landowners, whom he describes in his own sharp words as vain and insatiable beasts, accumulate vast resources but are ultimately compelled to distribute a portion of their wealth, simply because they are physically incapable of consuming it all themselves. Their sharing isn't motivated by benevolence, but rather by the sheer limits of their physical capacity. For, as he points out, a person might possess 10,000 acres of land, yet can only consume one meal at a time. Consequently, the less fortunate subsist on the remnants. This, then, is the invisible hand in a moral context, the wealthy inadvertently sustaining the poor because even unrestrained gluttony has its inescapable boundaries. This depiction is certainly not an ode to the virtues of economic inequality. Instead, it reads more like a morally weary sigh, acknowledging that even the most avaricious individuals must, by chance, eventually relinquish a meager portion of their excess. In essence, Smith's three invocations of the invisible hand are reducible to ancient superstition, personal fear, and the inherent physical constraints of human gluttony. These are hardly the hallowed pillars upon which neoliberal economics proudly stands. Despite its minimal presence and specific contexts, throughout the 20th century, this modest metaphor remarkably acquired a life and significance entirely of its own. Influential economists associated with the Chicago School, policymakers during the Reagan administration, powerful corporate lobbyists, and various pro-market think tanks collaboratively elevated the concept of the invisible hand from a mere figure of speech into a foundational economic doctrine. They skillfully presented it as irrefutable evidence that regulation was superfluous, that governmental intervention was intrinsically detrimental, and that markets, when unconstrained, would spontaneously generate optimal stability and prosperity. The invisible hand thus mutated from a nuanced metaphor into an unequivocal mandate, serving not as a framework for discerning market intricacies, but rather as a rhetorical weapon wielded against any form of economic regulation. Adam Smith, ironically, became the celebrated intellectual mascot of deregulation, despite dedicating a substantial portion of his career to cautioning that merchants, when operating without sufficient oversight, would inevitably manipulate and distort markets for their own self-aggrandizement. This profound reinterpretation of Smith's work was neither coincidental nor accidental. It was a deliberate and calculated strategic maneuver. With the rise of formidable industrial giants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the vast railroad networks, monolithic steel companies, and powerful oil barons, there arose a pressing need for a philosophical rationale to legitimize their immense power and influence. Figures like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller weren't seeking regulation. They yearned for a robust intellectual legitimacy to underpin their vast enterprises. They conveniently discovered this justification in a vastly oversimplified, and often distorted, version of Smith's intricate philosophy. Subsequently, the ideological battles of the Cold War further weaponized this simplified narrative. Capitalism required a compelling moral counter-narrative to communism, and Smith's invisible hand, brutally stripped of all its original nuance and context, readily served this purpose. It was aggressively promoted not as a thoughtful observation, but as an incontrovertible universal law, a law that, quite conveniently, served the interests of those who controlled and profited most from the prevailing economic system. What Adam Smith genuinely feared, however, was precisely the economic landscape that the 20th century would ultimately forge. Corporations of such immense scale and power that they could dictate prices, exert significant influence over legislative processes, and even overwhelm sovereign nations. He explicitly warned that merchants, if left unregulated, would inevitably deceive and oppress the public. He vigorously cautioned that unchecked monopolies would inexorably dismantle true competition. Furthermore, he strongly contended that governments had a crucial role to play, indeed a duty to intervene, to proactively prevent market distortions, safeguard the interests of workers, and uphold overall fairness within the economy. Yet, those who selectively championed Smith as their intellectual progenitor systematically disregarded these vital aspects of his work. Their curated version of Smith was profoundly simplified, thoroughly sanitized, and entirely divested of its foundational moral philosophy. Every critical warning was expunged, every essential nuance obliterated, and every inconvenient truth was painstakingly buried. This pattern is a recurring motif throughout history. Influential factions strategically extract a single sentence or concept that conveniently serves their agenda, while deliberately discarding the entirety of its original context and surrounding arguments. They readily cite the invisible hand, yet meticulously omit the passages where Smith unequivocally condemns the overreach and abuses of corporations. They laud his advocacy for markets, while conveniently overlooking his fervent indignation regarding economic inequality. They champion the notion of a free market, but conveniently forget that Smith himself perceived markets as intricate human constructs, not an immutable force of nature, and thus inherently requiring carefully established rules, diligent oversight, and robust moral boundaries. And here lies the inconvenient truth that contemporary policymakers assiduously sidestep. Smith never genuinely believed that individuals, when solely pursuing their self-interest, would consistently or reliably generate positive societal outcomes. On the contrary, he fully anticipated that such unbridled self-interest would frequently lead to profoundly detrimental consequences. The overarching objective of the Wealth of Nations was, in fact, to meticulously dissect and expose precisely why markets fail. Detailing the mechanisms through which monopolies emerge, cartels conspire to manipulate prices, corporations exert corrupting influence on governments, and economic power becomes dangerously concentrated. The invisible hand was never presented as the panacea. It was merely an isolated anomaly. Yet, remarkably, over the ensuing centuries, this rare anomaly was strategically transformed into the very cornerstone and brand identity of an entire economic philosophy. Fast-forwarding from Adam Smith's 18th century world to our present-day reality, the pervasive irony becomes almost excruciatingly apparent. We have constructed an entire global economic system founded upon a phrase Smith barely referenced, while simultaneously disregarding the hundreds of pages where he presciently cautioned against the very challenges we confront today. These include alarmingly concentrated power, the insidious influence of corporations over governmental policy, and markets warped not by overregulation, but by the privileged few who possess the means to dictate the rules themselves. Indeed, every major economic crisis of the past century, from the devastating Great Depression to the catastrophic 2008 financial collapse, can be traced directly back to the very pattern Smith foretold. When the most powerful economic actors operate unchecked in the shadows, the market ceases to function as a fair exchange mechanism. Instead, it devolves into a carefully orchestrated stage, where the rest of us are merely spectators, forced to subsidize the performance. Consider the contours of our contemporary economic landscape. Colossal tech giants wielding unprecedented control over information, formidable retail monopolies systematically stifling competition, and financial institutions whose catastrophic failures necessitate immense national bailouts. These are demonstrably not free markets. They are, in essence, sophisticated cartels adept at public relations. Furthermore, the peculiar solace that policymakers derive from invoking the invisible hand, treating it as if it were some cosmic, infallible safety net, registers less as sound economic theory and more as a form of unexamined superstition. It mirrors precisely the very belief Smith criticized in his earliest use of the metaphor, the inherent human tendency to conjure imaginary, unseen forces to perform the arduous tasks and responsibilities we ourselves are unwilling to undertake. The unvarnished truth is both simpler and significantly more disquieting. Markets do not miraculously rectify their own abuses. Power, left unchecked, does not spontaneously self-regulate. And unrestrained greed, if allowed to flourish, will ultimately devour everything in its relentless path, including the very system designed to reward it. The contemporary iteration of capitalism has, tragically, evolved into the precise entity Smith most deeply dreaded. A world where a select few can manipulate the economic playing field so profoundly that market outcomes appear to be predetermined destiny, rather than the consequence of deliberate design. However, comprehending Smith's authentic message doesn't cast a darker shadow upon our understanding of the world. Instead, it offers profound clarity. For Smith did not view the economy as an inherently doomed or unalterable force. Rather, he recognized it as fundamentally human, inherently flawed, yet entirely amenable to correction, and ultimately shaped by conscious choices. His true advocacy was for a delicate but robust balance. Markets empowered sufficiently to foster innovation, governments possessing adequate strength to impose necessary restraints, and societies cultivated to be wise enough to consistently demand and uphold fairness. Smith never offered the facile promise that an invisible hand would miraculously rescue us. Instead, his enduring argument was that the responsibility for our salvation ultimately rests with ourselves. While history may not repeat itself precisely, a profound lack of understanding of its lessons will, invariably, lead to similar detrimental outcomes. Should this discussion have offered you a fresh perspective, please consider subscribing for more insights. The past holds many answers, and I am here to guide you toward discovering them.